The translator kept cutting out. That was the first thing Marin Voss noticed when the Quelari delegation entered the hall. Not the 8-foot frames wrapped in iridescent chitin, not the 6-limbed silhouette of Admiral S. Sareth looming at the back, not the Queen herself moving through the crowd like a tide pulling everything toward her. No. It was the translator unit clipped to the iron pillar beside Gate 7, the one Marin had been assigned to monitor, blinking a stuttered amber instead of solid green. She tapped it twice with her knuckle. Nothing, tapped it again. The amber blinked on, blinked off, blinked on. She logged it in her tablet, flagged it for maintenance with a priority note, and went back to watching the crowd. That was her job, watch the crowd. She was a third-tier event security contractor, hired through a labor pool to staff the Provisional Assembly Hall on what the news feeds were calling the most significant diplomatic convening in human history. Her role was roughly equivalent to a velvet rope attendant at a stadium concert. She wore a gray jacket with a yellow stripe on the sleeve, the stripe indicating that she had cleared the background check required for proximity to a diplomatic proceeding, which was 3 steps above the baseline clearance required to direct pedestrian traffic at a transit hub. She had a comm badge and a handheld sensor wand, and no weapon of any kind, because the Quelari had made it a condition of attendance that no human in the hall carry arms. The real security, the UN enforcers, the private military contractors hired through the Swiss committee, the 3 Quelari honor guard units positioned near the dais, all of them had weapons. Marin had a wand that beeped when it detected ferrous metal above a certain threshold. She was, in the estimation of most people in that room, nobody. She'd been nobody for a long time. 41 years old, 11 of those spent in the contracting pool after the factory closures. She'd done event staffing, warehouse counting, transit crowd management, 1 year of hospital visitor logistics that had paid well and been relentless, and had left her with a persistent habit of watching the exits in any room she entered. She had 2 certifications on her file, and a reference from a supervisor she hadn't spoken to in 4 years. She lived alone in a flat in the outer ring of what used to be called Hamburg, which the provisional administrative maps now labeled Sector 7 North, because the Quelari had suggested early in the process that named zones introduced emotional volatility into administrative communication, and several of the provisional governments had adopted the suggestion, while the rest had argued about it. Marin's sector had adopted the numbers. She'd written that down when the orientation briefer had explained it. The phrase the briefer had used was, "Numbers are cleaner than names. Numbers don't carry sentiment. Numbers can be administered." Marin had underlined it. The war, if you could call it that, had lasted 19 months. The Quelari had not come to conquer in any sense humans would have recognized from their own history books. There were no invasion fleets in the classical sense, no beach landings, no aerial bombardment of population centers, no demands for unconditional surrender broadcast over hijacked radio frequencies. They had simply appeared in orbit, in numbers that made every satellite image look like a static storm. Their ships were not warships by any obvious definition. They were large, yes, incomprehensibly large, but they were organized around a logic of capacity and efficiency rather than firepower. They looked, someone had noted early on, like enormous filing cabinets, like warehouses that happened to hang in space. They had broadcast a message in 97 languages simultaneously, some of them languages that no longer had native speakers. The message was not a declaration of war. It was a census request. They wanted to know how many humans there were, where they lived in what densities, what resources they consumed at what rates, what functions they served in their social and economic structures, and what percentage of those functions could be classified as redundant. They asked the questions with the polite dispassion of a logistics company conducting an inventory audit of a warehouse they had recently acquired. When the UN Security Council protested and demanded to know on what authority the Quelari were conducting this survey, The Quelari had responded by disabling the electrical grid of 4 continents simultaneously for 11 minutes, then restoring it without comment. The message that followed the restoration simply repeated the census request. That had been the opening. What followed was not war in the kinetic sense, though kinetic things did happen. Quelari ground parties moved through cities with surveying equipment and analytical tools, cataloging structures, inventorying resources, classifying populations by productivity metrics. Human militaries, after several weeks of escalating warnings and protocols that the Quelari appeared to receive and file, and not modify their behavior in response to, opened fire. Quelari units returned fire with weapons that turned armored vehicles into quiet, collapsed sculptures of fused metal and silicate. Humans died in the thousands in those first engagements, and then in larger numbers as the Quelari logging operations met organized armed resistance and responded with proportional, carefully calibrated force. The calibration was, in its way, the most disturbing element. Not escalation, not rage, not the terrible momentum of a civilization deciding to destroy another. Just precise, mathematical response. Each human threat assessed. Each response sized to eliminate the threat, without unnecessary collateral expenditure of Quelari resources. The Quelari, it became clear over the following months, were not angry. They were not afraid. They were not ideologically driven, in the sense of having decided that humans deserved to be destroyed or enslaved or punished. They were managing a process. Humans were being cataloged. That was the word that appeared in every captured Quelari administrative document, translated by the small army of xenolinguists working in hastily constructed bunkers across what remained of the free territories. Not conquered, not subjugated, not defeated. Cataloged. A number. The resistance had formed in the gaps between the Quelari cataloging operations. Human fighters who knew their cities better than any survey map, who moved through sewers and basements and maintenance tunnels that the Quelari were still mapping. Guerrilla cells, underground networks, the particular improvised stubbornness of people who had nowhere else to go. They'd slowed the process, disrupted supply routes, managed here and there to recover territory and hold it longer than the Quelari models apparently predicted. They'd bought time. They'd bought 19 months of time, at enormous cost, until the resistance leadership had accepted what the military analysts had been saying for 6 of those months. They could not win through attrition. The Quelari had too much. Too many ships, too many units, too much patient methodical capacity, and, crucially, too little to lose. They had not come here out of desperation or need. They had come here because this was the next item in a filing system that stretched across 4 dozen worlds, and their response to resistance was to increase the resource allocation to the cataloging operation until the resistance was resolved. The only play left, the analysts said, was the table. Get a delegation to a table. Get a queen to the table. Make a case, not a military case, not a case based on human capacity to inflict costs, but a case based on something else. Something that might give the Quelari pause. Extract some recognition, some acknowledgement, some crack in the administrative framework. It was, the most optimistic of the analysts said, a long shot. It was, the honest one said, the only shot. Which was why Queen Velareth was here. And which was why the Assembly Hall, a converted concert venue in the rebuilt center of what used to be called Geneva, its original stage now a diplomatic dais, its original seating now arranged into sections for delegations and observers and press and public witnesses, its original ceiling now strung with enough translation equipment and sensor, arrays to process 40 simultaneous language channels, was full of diplomats and generals and resistance commanders and UN officials and translators, and approximately 400 event contractors in gray jackets with yellow stripes, most of whom were wondering if this was the last day of normal human history or merely the penultimate one. Marin watched the crowd. She watched Gate 7's translator. She watched the Queen. Velareth was extraordinary. That was simply true, and Marin had learned enough in the years since to understand that beauty comes in forms that have nothing to do with human aesthetics. But this was something even more basic than beauty. Velerith was extraordinary in the way that things which have been extraordinary for a very long time become. Not the performance of authority, but the settled possession of it, worn the way a person who has always been tall wears their height, without thinking about it, without using it, just as a given quality of their existence that everything around them arranges itself to accommodate. The Quelari were insected in their deep structure, exoskeletal, multi-limbed, oriented around a social logic that had evolved from something hive-derived, though the xenoanthropologists were careful to note that the Quelari dominion bore about as much resemblance to an insect hive as human civilization bore to a primate band. They had taken the hive's base material and done something else with it entirely, something that had developed over millennia, its own categories of individual distinction, status, creativity, and the particular Quelari analog of ambition, which their administrative language rendered as something closer to the drive to impose efficient order on chaos, but which looked, from certain angles, like what humans meant when they said they wanted to build something that lasted. Velerith's caste had evolved in a direction that human biology might have labeled aristocratic, if it was willing to use a word that loaded. She stood taller than her honor guard by almost a full head. Her chitin was a deep, almost black violet with iridescent green at the joints that caught the light differently with every movement, shifting from green to gold, to a blue so pure it was almost painful. She had 2 primary arms, large and multi-jointed, and 4 lateral manipulator limbs that ranged from shorter and more delicate near her waist to longer and more structural at her shoulders, and she moved all 6 with a fluid, coordinated grace that managed to suggest she was not performing her passage through the room, but simply occupying it, the way light occupies a space. Her crest, the fan of sensory plates that ran from her crown down to her shoulders, currently extended to full display, caught the overhead lighting and scattered it in patterns that the xenolinguist briefing note said indicated formal authority and ceremonial attention. She was, Marin thought, like watching something from before the age of mercy, not cruel, just ancient and certain and arranged by different rules. The Quelari delegation moved to the dais, in a formation that the briefing note said was called the administrative configuration, which placed Velerith at the center-forward position flanked by Sarath on her left and the senior diplomatic liaison on her right, with the technical and analytical staff arranged in a precise chevron behind. They moved in total silence, which was a Quelari courtesy. Their natural communication included subsonic components that humans found physiologically uncomfortable in enclosed spaces, and the delegation had agreed to moderate their subsonic output during the proceedings. The UN Secretary-General, a small, precise Ugandan man named Odhiambo, moved to the podium on the human side of the dais. He had the face of a man who had been preparing for this day for 2 years, and was now that he was here experiencing the particular gap between preparation and the thing you were preparing for. He welcomed the Quelari delegation with the careful formality of someone who knew that any wrong word might be the last word spoken at this table, and had the composure not to let that knowledge into his voice. The translators, the real ones, the certified xenolinguists with full Quelari language training, 3 of them stationed at the edges of the stage, with equipment that had taken 18 months of trilateral negotiation to agree upon, murmured into their earpieces, with the controlled precision of people who understood that their accuracy in the next several hours might be the most consequential professional work any human being had done. Marin watched Gate 7. The amber light blinked. The first hour was ceremonial in the way that critical events always have a ceremonial shell around them. Not because anyone present believed that the ceremony itself mattered, but because the ceremony is the shared action that establishes that you are all in the same room together under the same agreed-upon rules, And without that establishment, the room is just a collection of people with unresolved conflicts. There were protocols. There was the reading of a joint statement that had taken 11 weeks to draft, moving through 17 versions, each version representing a different arrangement of sentences that both sides' legal teams could accept without either side's diplomatic teams declaring that they had conceded too much. The final version contained, Marin had overheard someone say in the staff briefing, approximately 14 sentences that both sides genuinely agreed on, and 200 that neither side had any intention of honoring, but which both sides had agreed to pretend to intend to honor, because the pretense was the beginning of something, and the beginning of something was better than what they'd had before. There were acknowledgments. There were formal translations of the acknowledgments. There were responses to the acknowledgments. Marin checked Gate 7. She updated her maintenance log. She watched the crowd. She'd been watching crowds professionally for 11 years, and she'd gotten very good at it in the way that you get good at things you do constantly and carefully. Not through any particular talent, but through the accumulated weight of attention paid over time. She could look at a crowd and tell within about 90 seconds whether it was calm or volatile, whether the volatility was focused or diffuse, where the pressure points were, which parts of the room were talking too much and which were too quiet. She could see the specific body language of people who were about to do something, not necessarily anything bad, just the pre-action tension that people shed before they act. What she saw in this crowd was fear mostly, contained and managed but present. Experienced fear, the kind that people have when they've been afraid for a long time and have developed a working relationship with it. Not paralyzed, not performing courage, just carrying the weight with the particular efficiency of people who have had no choice but to get efficient at it. She also saw despair, and she saw the particular configuration of features that appears on people's faces when they are running a calculation and not liking the result. The look not of someone who has gotten bad news, but of someone who is in the process of realizing that news they thought might be better than expected is exactly as bad as the worst estimate. Then Admiral S. Sareth spoke. He was Velarith's senior military commander, and he spoke in the flat, precise cadence that Quelari commanders apparently favored, each clause delivered with the rhythm of a formal report being read into a record. No emotional coloration, no pause for effect or emphasis or human things. The certified translators rendered it simultaneously through the room speaker system. Marin could hear the English feed through the small speaker mounted on the pillar near Gate 7, the amber blinking translator beneath it silent and useless. The Quelari Dominion acknowledges the existence of organized human resistance. The Dominion classifies this resistance as a systemic anomaly within the cataloging process. Anomalies are resolved. The purpose of this convening is to establish the timeline and parameters for anomaly resolution. The Quelari Dominion offers the following terms. He listed them. Marin listened. Around her, the crowd shifted. She watched the shifts as S. Sareth's translated voice moved through the room, watched how the changes in posture and breath tracked the terms like a barometer tracking a storm. Zone restructuring, which meant the redrawing of human administrative territories along Quelari efficiency metrics. Population reallocation, which meant the movement of people from areas of overlapping settlement to areas of cataloging need, managed on schedules the Quelari would determine. The folding of human governance structures into Quelari administrative systems, at a pace consistent with efficient integration. The continuation of cataloging operations without interference from resistance elements, which was a phrase whose meaning was extremely clear. The establishment of Quelari administrative oversight at the territorial level, and then the regional level, and then, at a timeline the terms left deliberately unspecified at the planetary level. All of it described in the flat, careful, clean language of logistics. The word human appeared twice in S. Sareth's entire address. Every other reference was cataloged unit, residential element, organic resource component, or resistance anomaly. Marin looked at the crowd. At the diplomatic tables, she saw the Secretary General's hands, resting on the surface in front of him, perfectly still in a way that she recognized from years of watching people receive bad news in real time. The stillness of extreme effort, the body's decision to stop moving rather than betray what it knew. She saw the translators at the edges of the stage, maintaining their professional concentration, with the focused containment of people who cannot afford to react to what they are translating. She saw a cluster of resistance leaders in the observer-adjacent section. Commander Halas, whose face had been on every news feed for 6 months, the woman who'd led the Budapest corridor defense and had been quoted 100 times saying that humanity would not be reduced to numbers. And Halas was watching Sareth finish his address with an expression that Marin had never seen on a military commander's face in any of the hours of footage she'd consumed over the past 19 months. She looked like she was trying to figure out how to grieve. Then the Queen spoke. Velarith's voice was not what Marin had expected from the briefing notes, which had described Quelari communication in clinical terms: harmonics, subsonic components, frequency ranges, the physiological effects on human auditory and nervous systems. All of that was accurate. There was a low pressure in the room when Velarith spoke, a vibration at the base of the sternum that was not painful but was impossible to ignore, like standing near something enormous that is very quietly running. But the briefing notes had failed to convey the quality of her upper register voice. The part that translated, which was something that the word musical didn't quite fit, but that musical was the closest word for. It was ordered. It had rhythms and cadences that felt intentional at a level below conscious craft, the way really good architecture feels right without your being able to say immediately why. The translation flattened it, the way all translation flattened everything into the receiving language's grammar and rhythm. But even through the flatness, you could hear the shape of something that had never needed to explain itself and was now choosing to. The Quelari Dominion has observed human civilization for a period of your 19 months, Velarith said. We have conducted extensive cataloging operations. We have encountered resistance to these operations, which the Admiral has characterized as an anomaly within the cataloging process. I wish to be precise about our assessment of this characterization. She paused. The room was entirely silent. Marin realized she had not blinked in several seconds. The anomaly is not your resistance. The anomaly is our assumption. We arrived at this world with a framework. We applied the framework. The framework does not fit. Another pause. This is unusual for us. Our framework has been applied to 47 cataloged worlds in the current administration cycle. It has fit 46 of them with sufficient fidelity to proceed to integration. You are the one world where it has not fit. We have continued applying it because we had no alternative framework to offer. But we have noted, internally and in our administrative records, that the fit is poor. We are here in part because we do not yet understand why. The room was quiet in a way that rooms are rarely quiet. Not the quiet of people being polite, but the quiet of people who have just heard something they weren't expecting and are still processing whether it means what they think it means. We do not come to this table as a party that believes itself to be in error, Velarith continued. We come as a party that has encountered a variable it does not have a category for. We are not accustomed to this position. We are not certain what it means. We present it to this convening as the actual condition we are in, rather than the condition our administrative language would prefer we were in. The next hour proceeded in the ceremonial mode, but with a quality beneath the ceremony that Marin could feel from Gate 7, something under the room's surface like water moving just below a frozen lake. The formal exchanges continued. The protocols unfolded. But the energy in the room had changed with Velarith's last words, and the change hadn't settled. People were recalculating. Marin watched the crowd. She watched the amber light. She watched the Queen. She had worked enough events to know what a room looked like when it was building towards something, Not necessarily something bad, just something. A moment approaching from a direction nobody had anticipated. She'd seen it at labor negotiations when a junior rep from one side said the thing the senior negotiators hadn't said. She'd seen it at public hearings when someone in the public gallery said something simple that cut through 2 hours of expert testimony and made everyone in the room realize they'd been arguing about the wrong thing. She'd watched those moments come. She'd watched them land. She had never been the person who said the thing because that wasn't the job. The job was to watch the crowd. But she'd always known, in those moments, that what she was watching was the room waiting for someone. The room right now was waiting. The formal statements concluded. A Quellari technical analyst delivered a presentation on integration methodology. The Secretary General's deputy offered a careful response that acknowledged the anomaly Velareth had referenced and requested that the closed session be used to explore it more fully. The Quellari liaison seconded this. Time was called. A brief procedural recess was announced, to last 15 minutes before the session resumed with the formal agenda for the closed session. The room began to move, the particular choreography of large-scale diplomatic proceedings during a break, people consulting, moving to the edges, checking devices, the controlled chaos of 100 parallel conversations happening simultaneously. The contracted floor staff, of which Marin was one, moved to their posted positions and held them. Gate 7, amber light, maintenance log, job done. Then, from the public observer section, someone stood up. He was not a diplomat. Marin registered this before she registered anything else about him. He was in the public observer seats, the 100-odd seats allocated to vetted civilian witnesses, people selected by lottery from an application pool that had apparently received 4 million submissions from across the remaining free territories. He was a middle-aged man, heavyset, with the large, careful hands of someone who worked with tools and materials, a face that had been outdoors in weather. He was wearing a visitor identification lanyard over a plain dark shirt, and when he rose to his feet in the packed observer section, both UN security personnel near that section and 2 of the Quellari honor guard units on the dais rotated toward him with the synchronized attention of people whose training responds to deviations from expected patterns. "May I ask something?" His voice was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the voice of a man who had something to say and was saying it, without amplification, in a room full of people with amplification. He had to repeat it. The first attempt was absorbed by the general noise of the recess period. And when he said it the second time louder, there was something in the plain directness of it that made the room begin to quiet around him. A UN security officer was moving toward the observer section. The procedural note in the briefing had been clear that the floor was not open to public comment during the formal proceedings. But the noise was falling away. People were turning, and Velareth, who had been moving toward the Quellari delegation's recess area, had stopped. The sensory crest at her shoulders adjusted. She had turned toward the observer section. "Wait," she said. One word, the translation unit rendered it flat and small. But she had stopped moving, and her crest was extended, and the security officer paused. "A catalogued unit wishes to address the Dominion," she said, not hostile, not contemptuous. The inflection, even through the translation unit's flatness, carried something that in a human would have been curiosity. The room was very quiet. Benedict Farber, he was, Marin would learn later, a boilermaker from Linz, the kind of work that involved maintaining and repairing industrial heating systems, a trade that had contracted dramatically in the decade before the Quellari arrival and contracted further since. The work itself not gone, but the economic structures around it increasingly reorganized. Benedict Farber looked at the queen of a civilization that had catalogued and integrated 46 worlds, and he said, "You said your framework doesn't fit. I want to know if you know why." The translator rendered this in Quellari harmonics. Marin watched Velareth's crest. The iridescent green at the joint seemed brighter, somehow, though that might have been the angle. "No," Velerith said. "We do not." "Then I'll tell you." The room made a sound. Not a loud sound. A breath, really, the collective exhale and intake of 400 people who had just realized that the recess was over, that something was about to happen that was not on the agenda, and that nobody in this room had the authority to stop it. Benedict Farber looked steadily at Velerith. "You cataloged us as units. That's the mistake. You measured everything we have and got numbers that made sense to you. And then when you went to apply what the numbers told you, it didn't work, because the numbers aren't what we are." Velerith's lateral limbs drew in slightly, not aggression, something more careful than aggression. "Then what are you?" she asked. "We're what we mean to each other," Farber said. "A long beat. Every number you assigned, that was a person who was something to someone else. A mother, a mechanic, the person who taught someone to swim, the neighbor who showed up at 2 in the morning when the pipes burst because they heard you were in trouble and it didn't occur to them not to come. None of that shows up in a catalog. None of it shows up in a resource assessment or a population density report or an integration timeline. But all of it is the thing that makes us fight. You can catalog everything we have and everything we do and you still won't know what we are. Because what we are is in between us, in the connections, in what we carry for each other." He paused. "Your framework measures the items. It doesn't have a field for what holds the items together." The silence that followed was very long. Admiral S. Sarath spoke. His voice was clipped, the cadence of command. "This unit is in violation of floor protocol. Security should." "Wait." Velerith's primary arm rose. She was looking at Farber, just looking at him. Her crest had extended to full formal display, the same display she'd worn on entry, the one the briefing note said indicated the highest level of attentive authority. "I am not finished with this." She turned her full regard on Benedict Farber, Boilermaker, lottery winner, man from Linz, with the deliberateness of something that has never needed to hurry. "You say we lack a category for this, the connections you describe, the things that hold the items together." "Yes," Farber said. "Then our catalog is insufficient." "Yes." "Then the anomaly in our framework is this insufficiency." "Yes," Farber said, "that's it exactly." S. Sarath made a sound that the translation unit rendered as a formal objection. Velerith raised her arm again and held it there, and S. Sarath went silent. She seemed to be thinking, or whatever the Quelari analog of thinking was, the process by which a mind that had been built for something encounters something it wasn't built for and adjusts. "The resistance forces we have encountered," she said slowly, the translator unit keeping pace, "have not behaved in the patterns our models predicted. They have demonstrated resource commitments that exceed rational self-interest as we calculate it. Defensive actions have been mounted for territories of no strategic value. Combatants have accepted certain death to protect," she paused, "to protect collections of objects and persons that our assessments rated as low value." "Low value to you," Farber said, "everything to someone." "Yes," Velerith said, "this is what we did not model." What happened next took 3 hours. Not 3 hours of formal procedure, though that is how it would later be described in the official record. 3 hours of the most unusual conversation Marin had ever been in the presence of. A halting, historically unprecedented, occasionally confused dialogue, mediated by exhausted certified translators, facilitated by a Secretary General who had the wisdom to recognize that his job in this moment was to get out of the way, and populated by voices that protocol had never expected to be in this room. Farber continued. He wasn't eloquent in any formal sense. He didn't have the compressed precision of a diplomat or the rhetorical shaping of a practiced public speaker. He talked the way people talk when they know something from the inside, from having lived it, and are trying to find words that match the knowing. He made errors. He repeated himself. He backed up and tried again. He said things that weren't quite right, and then, when Velerith's questions pressed him, found the version that was closer to right. But he was patient, and he was honest, and he stayed. Other voices joined. The Secretary General, after 15 minutes of careful observation, asked a question that came from somewhere south of diplomacy and north of honest inquiry. Commander Hallas rose and spoke, not as a commander, but as a person describing the Budapest corridor, describing what 11 days of holding a street-by-street defense against Quelari logging units had felt like from the inside, describing the particular kind of courage that isn't about not being afraid, but about being afraid and continuing anyway, because the alternative is the place where the people you love don't exist anymore. A Quelari senior analyst, not military, not administrative, one of the cultural and scientific staff the delegation had brought to process data from the negotiations, asked a question that landed in the room with the weight of something unexpected. When you say, the place you love, can you be more specific about the mechanism of this? What is the operational process by which a geographic location acquires what you describe as love? The room went briefly quiet. Commander Hallas looked at the analyst for a long moment. Then she said, "Come to Budapest, walk around, I'll show you." The translator unit at Gate 7 kept blinking amber. Marin didn't try to fix it, she was listening. She was watching the Queen. Velerith had accepted a human chair. This, too, felt like a watershed, though she couldn't have explained why. Someone had brought it from a side room, a plain conference chair, and Velerith had sat in it in the wrong configuration for a Quelari physiology, lateral limbs spread for balance, the chair visibly inadequate and visibly occupied anyway. She was leaning forward on her primary arms in a posture that the briefing notes did not have a reference for, crest at partial display, listening to a boilermaker and a resistance commander explain what held human civilization together. She was asking questions. Good questions, specific questions, the questions of someone who is genuinely trying to understand a thing rather than confirm a position. The session that had been scheduled to recess, that had been scheduled to move to a closed session for the real work, was the real work. The recess came eventually, called by Velerith herself, which was not in the script. The Quelari delegation withdrew. The human contingent did what large groups of people do when they've been in the presence of something enormous. They sat down wherever they could. They talked in low, urgent voices. They tried to metabolize what had happened in a room still vibrating with it. Several people were openly crying. Several more were trying not to. Hallas was sitting in her seat with her face in her hands, not in distress, Marin thought, but in the specific posture of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and is trying to remember how to hold it now that it might be lighter. Benedict Farber was in the observer section, surrounded. Every diplomatic aide, every resistance coordinator, every person with any kind of rank or institutional role who could reach him was reaching him, offering things, hands, cards, statements, gratitude. He was handling it with the slightly dazed patience of a man who had said the thing he was going to say and had not thought very far past the saying of it. Someone had given him a cup of something hot. He was holding it in both hands, the way people hold things they've been given when they're not sure what to do with their hands. Marin watched him from Gate 7. That's it, she thought. That's the whole thing right there. A man holding a cup in both hands in a room that might be the hinge of human history, and the cup is warm, and his hands know what to do with warmth even when his head doesn't know what to do with anything else. She logged Gate 7 as clear. The crowd was holding position per protocol. She updated the maintenance flag on the translator and changed the priority level upward. She watched the room settle into itself. The closed session lasted 4 hours. Marin spent them in the corridor outside Gate 7, which was fluorescent and industrial and smelled of cleaning fluid, and the particular anxiety that settles into the ventilation systems of buildings when large amounts of human worry has been processed inside them for a long time. She was not alone. The other contracted floor staff from her shift were out here, sitting on the floor or standing in loose configurations, phones in hand but mostly not used. There was a quality of waiting that filled the corridor like a weather system, not anxious exactly, just present, the specific weight of being in the anteroom of something. At some point, near the second hour, someone's phone played music. 3 or 4 seconds of something with strings before they silenced it quickly, embarrassed by the noise. Marin didn't recognize the piece. But the corridor had been full of it, briefly. Everyone in the corridor had been full of it, briefly. And then it was gone, and the silence felt different from the silence before, charged with the recent memory of something that wasn't the crisis, something that had no administrative classification. She thought about the Quellari analyst asking what the mechanism was, the operational process by which love was acquired for a location. She thought about what the answer actually was. The answer was the same thing the music just did, the same thing the cup of something hot in Farber's hands was doing, the same thing all of it was doing, constantly, invisibly, in the connections between people that no catalog had a field for. The mechanism was repetition and presence, and the accumulated weight of shared small things, until the place where the small things happened became inseparable from the people they'd happened to. Until the street corner and the neighbor and the memory and the person you called at 2 in the morning were all part of the same thing, and you couldn't protect one without defending the others. The closed session ended. She heard it in the way large spaces announce their own events, the change in sound, the movement of people, the specific frequency of voices when something has been decided and the deciding is finished. She moved to her position at Gate 7. Secretary General Adhiambo's press liaison came through the corridor in a fast walk, and Marin said, without thinking, "Well." The liaison stopped, looked at her, evaluated her, the gray jacket, the yellow stripe, the maintenance tablet, the wand, made a decision. "Provisional suspension of cataloging operations," she said, "pending a joint commission, structured bilateral dialogue. Quellari delegation will remain on Earth, one city voluntary designation for a period of study." Study of what? The liaison was already moving again. She threw the answer over her shoulder without slowing. "Of us." The Joint Commission took 18 months and produced 800 pages of documentation and approximately 14 actual changes to anything. This was, by the standards of international diplomacy, an extremely productive outcome. Marin followed it from the contracting pool. She went back to the transit counting and the event staffing and the warehouse shifts, the ordinary invisible infrastructure of a society that was not quite the same society it had been 19 months ago and was not yet whatever it was going to become. She read the news feeds in fragments, on her phone during breaks. She assembled a picture over time. The Quellari delegation stationed in Vienna, they had chosen Vienna, in the end, on the basis of what she had been told, was a cultural analyst's recommendation, though the analyst's reasoning was never published, conducted themselves in ways that the analysts found surprising and the commentators found confusing. They were not there to inspect or catalog. They were there to observe in a different mode, one that seemed closer to what humans meant when they said they were learning something. They attended public events. They visited institutions. They asked questions of ordinary people, not through formal channels but through translators accompanying Quellari analysts on what appeared to be something like field research, though the Quellari didn't use that term. And Velarith came herself. Marin had not expected this, though she wasn't sure why it surprised her. The Queen had sat in a human chair for 3 hours and asked genuine questions. It was not such a large step from that to coming to Vienna. There were photographs. Velarith at the Kunsthistorisches Museum. Velarith at a market, standing very still while a vendor explained the provenance of something to her through a translator, the vendor apparently untroubled by the 8-foot iridescent figure listening with complete attention. Velerith at a concert, the Vienna Philharmonic, a full evening program in a hall that had been carefully emptied and then refilled at Velerith's specific request with a normal audience rather than a selected diplomatic group. I wish to hear it in the context in which it exists, she had apparently told the commission liaison, not in a presentation. The concert photograph had stayed with Marin. It was taken from the balcony, a wide angle that showed the whole hall, musicians packing up, audience filing out toward the exits, the normal dissolution of a shared event back into individual lives. And in the third row from the stage, a figure that was obviously not human, too tall by half, the spread of lateral limbs unmistakable even at rest, sitting completely still while everything moved around her, not looking at anything in particular. Just sitting. The caption read, Queen Velerith, Vienna Philharmonic, March 14th. The comments were full of the usual range: fear, wonder, suspicion, dark jokes, people trying to process an extraordinary thing by making it ordinary. Someone had asked what an alien queen thought she was going to learn from a violin. Marin had almost scrolled past. Then she typed an answer, hit post before she could second-guess it, and put her phone in her pocket. The same thing we do. She got the message 11 months after the provisional accord was signed. It came through the labor pool system, which was not where she expected significant things to come from. It was from an administrative address she didn't recognize, a commission-adjacent clearinghouse. It offered her a position as supervising floor contractor for the ongoing Joint Commission working sessions, which had become a permanent feature of the post-accord landscape. The pay was significantly better than what she was making. The role was, watch the room, make sure the room functioned. She said yes. The work was different from event staffing in the way that all work is different from the category you put it in before you're doing it. The Joint Commission working sessions were smaller than the Assembly Hall event, more numerous, more various, sometimes technical, sometimes conceptual, sometimes something that resisted any category and just needed to be held open as a space where the holding open was itself the work. Marin's job was still floor management, still access control, still the 1,000 small invisible maintenance tasks that make a physical space able to contain the things people are trying to do in it. But the space was unusual, and the things people were trying to do in it were unlike anything that had been tried before. And after a while, she stopped thinking of the work as event staffing and started thinking of it as something she didn't have a word for yet. The Quelari, she learned, were extremely good at certain kinds of process and extremely poor at certain other kinds. They were precise, organized, thorough, patient, and entirely comfortable with long timelines. They were less good at ambiguity, at the particular human skill of being partially wrong and continuing anyway, at the intuition that sometimes the most useful thing is to say the thing that doesn't fit the framework because the framework has a hole in it. These were things that the Commission was trying to build a shared language for, and it was slow, difficult, and frequently uncomfortable work, and it was work. She met Velerith twice more before the meeting that mattered. The first time was at a full session, formal and brief, Marin at her post, the Queen passing through, a moment of mutual recognition expressed in a slight adjustment of Velerith's crest that Marin had by then learned enough to read as acknowledgement. The second was at an informal working session, where the Queen sat at the long commission table and listened to 3 hours of human testimony about what neighborhoods felt like from the inside, asking occasional questions through the translation system with the careful precision of someone building a vocabulary for a concept they'd never needed before. The third time, they were alone in the conference room. It was a working session about the gap in the catalog, the question that had opened everything, formalized now into a research agenda that had its own subcommittee and its own literature. The Quelari were trying to develop a framework for what they were calling, in the translation unit's best approximation, the connective substrate of human social organization, which was 8 words for what Farber had said in 3. What we mean. The session had been technical and dense and had run long, and when the recess came, most people filed out, but Velerith remained at the end of the table, reviewing something on a Quelari data surface. Marin was at the equipment panel, running the standard post-session check. They were the only 2 in the room. After a moment, Velerith said through the small tabletop translation unit, the sound slightly delayed, the rendering slightly flat. "You were at the assembly, Gate 7. "Yes," Marin said. "You remained at your post throughout." "It was my post." While the Boilermaker spoke, while the session extended beyond its scheduled parameters, while the diplomatic staff adjusted to an unplanned dynamic. "Yes." A pause. The lateral limbs moved in a small, contained gesture that Marin had by now learned was not in any of the gesture glossaries she'd been given, which meant it was something that arose naturally rather than ceremonially. "You were watching," Velerith said. "That's what the job is." "What did you see?" Marin thought about this. She had thought about it many times in the months since. What had she seen, precisely, in the room that day? Not the event as she'd understand it later, with all the context that came after. What had she seen in real time from Gate 7, while it was happening? "I saw a room that had given up on itself," she said. Before he stood up, "I saw a room that was still going through the motions because going through the motions was the only plan left, but the people doing the motions had stopped believing in the plan. And then I saw the room remember something." Velerith's crest extended slightly. "What did it remember?" "That it was full of people," Marin said. "Not units, not numbers, people, and that one of them had something to say." "You anticipated that this would happen?" "No," Marin said. "I thought something needed to happen. I didn't know what." "You were watching for the moment." "I was watching the room. The moment came." The Queen was quiet for a while. The tabletop unit hummed softly. Outside the conference room, there were the sounds of the commission staff moving through the corridor, the ordinary sounds of a building at work. "We do not have this practice," Velerith said eventually, "watching a room for what it has not yet said." "No," Marin agreed. "Our analysts monitor proceedings for deviation from expected parameters, for anomalies." "That's not quite the same thing." "No," Velerith said, "it is not." Another long quiet. "The Boilermaker," Velerith said. "He asked me a question at the signing. I did not have an answer at the time." "What did he ask?" "He asked if I had enjoyed the concert, the Vienna Philharmonic in March." Marin waited. "I had not been asked this kind of question before," Velerith said. "Whether I had enjoyed something. The concept does not translate well into our administrative language. The analyst working on the connective substrate study has been attempting to develop an equivalent term and reports that it is." A pause, the slight delay of the translation unit, resistant to reduction. "Yes," Marin said, "it is." "I have been thinking about the strings since that evening," Velerith said. "The violin strings, repeatedly. I find that I return to the memory of the sound without a clear purpose in doing so. This is unusual. Our memory systems are organized around retrieval for function. A memory that returns without retrieval request is anomalous." Marin felt something in her chest that she didn't have a word for, not quite warmth, something closer to recognition. "We have a word for that," she said. "Yes," Velerith said. "I have been told that you do. I have been trying to understand what the word means beyond its definition." A pause. "I believe the answer to the Boilermaker's question is yes." She rose from the table. The lateral limbs spread for balance. The crest settled into something between formal and resting. "Thank you," she said, through the translator, to Marin, who had her maintenance tablet in her hand and was standing at the equipment panel. "For what?" Marin asked. "For watching the room," Velerith said. "For being present in it as it was, rather than as it was scheduled to be." Then she was through the door, moving with the unhurried certainty of something that had somewhere it wanted to go. Marin stood in the conference room for a moment in the silence after. The translation unit on the table had gone to standby mode, the small status light switching from active green to resting amber. She watched it for a moment. Then she went to the equipment panel, completed the systems check, packed the maintenance tablet, and moved toward the door. Gate 7's translator had been showing solid green for months now. The part had been replaced within a week of the assembly event. The maintenance ticket had been resolved. The amber light was gone. She thought, sometimes, about what would have happened if it hadn't been blinking that day. If the translator beside her post had been functioning correctly, and she'd had something to look at other than the crowd. If she'd been distracted by a functioning system instead of a broken one. If she'd been watching the equipment instead of watching the room. She thought about all the small malfunctions and coincidences and logistical quirks that had put a Boilermaker from Linz in a lottery seat, that had put a Ugandan Secretary General at the podium, that had put a queen whose framework didn't fit in a room where someone would tell her why. None of it was in the catalog. None of it would show up in the record as having been planned or predicted or architectured. It had happened the way most human things happened, through the accumulation of small accidents and ordinary presences, and the particular stubbornness of people who were in a room, and decided not to leave without saying the thing that needed saying. Numbers. She had been in every system that tracked her a number. She still was. Sector 7 North, contracting pool, clearance level, skill set, wage rate. She appeared in administrative records as a unit, efficiently cataloged, her coordinates in every relevant database precise and current. The commission, when it processed her payroll, knew exactly where she was and what she cost. What it could not know, what no catalog had a field for, what the subcommittee on connective substrate was still building a language to describe, was what she'd been doing at Gate 7, what she'd seen, what she'd carried home, what she thought about when she watched the city change slowly around her, the Quelari presence in the world shifting from administrative occupation to something that didn't have a word yet, something that was still being figured out day by day between people who were trying. What the catalog couldn't hold was the experience of standing in a room at the worst possible moment in the history of your species, and watching a man with a cup of something hot say the true thing, and knowing, from Gate 7, amber light blinking, maintenance wand in hand, nobody, that you had been there when it happened, that you had seen it, that it was yours. The corridor outside was ordinary, fluorescent, industrial, the sounds of a building doing its work. Marin walked through it toward the elevator, toward the train, toward home. The commission's next session was in 4 days. She'd be there. The work wasn't done. The work, she suspected, was not the kind of work that was ever quite done. Not this kind. The kind that was about figuring out how to hold space for the things that didn't reduce to numbers, the connections and the warmths and the small accumulated weight of people meaning something to each other. That work would outlast her. It might outlast the commission. It might outlast all of them. But it was happening. Every session, every translated question, every moment when a Quelari analyst leaned forward to understand something about what love meant as a mechanism, it was happening. The framework was being rebuilt, not replaced, rebuilt with new fields. Marin took the elevator down, she took the train, she went home. It was, as evenings went, entirely ordinary. It was, as evenings went, exactly enough. She kept, in the years that followed, a habit she'd had since long before the Quelari came. When she arrived at a new space, the commission rooms, transit platforms, the outer ring markets where the Sector 7 North residents bought their food and their tools and their small domestic comforts, she would spend the first 5 minutes just watching, not analyzing exactly, not running the professional crowd monitoring assessment, just watching the way you watch a river, interested in the water, not trying to stop it. She had started doing this as a professional reflex, a habit built from 11 years of watching crowds so that she could predict them. But at some point, it had become something else. Something she didn't have a word for that felt adjacent to what Velerith had described about returning, without retrieval request, to the memory of the strings. What she watched in those 5 minutes was the connections. Not the people individually. The connections. The man at the corner stall who knew the woman buying fish by name and knew her mother had been unwell and asked after her before he weighed anything. The 2 children racing each other down the transit platform steps, while their father watched with the specific face of a parent who is simultaneously prepared to intervene and deeply hoping not to have to. The teenager sitting on the bench with headphones and the older person sitting at the other end of the same bench, and the invisible negotiation of shared space that they conducted without acknowledging each other, arriving at a comfortable distribution of the available seating, with neither having spoken a word. The field, the connective substrate, the things between the numbers. She tried once to explain this to the commission's data coordinator, a young woman named Selina who had the particular brightness of someone who genuinely believed that better data solved most problems, and who was not wrong exactly, but who had not yet encountered the full range of what better could mean. "What I'm watching," Marin had said, "is the information that the data doesn't capture. Not because it can't be captured, but because it doesn't stop moving long enough to be recorded." Selina had thought about this for a moment. "You mean emergent behavior?" "Maybe," Marin had said. "Or maybe I mean that the behavior is the thing, and calling it emergent is just saying we showed up after it started." Selina had looked at her with the expression of someone encountering a thought they weren't sure they had the right framework for yet, and then she'd gone back to her data, and Marin had respected that, because that was the job and the job mattered. The data mattered. The records and the tracking and the careful documentation of what had been decided and what had changed all mattered. You couldn't hold a civilization together with nothing but the invisible things. But you couldn't hold it together without them, either. That was the whole argument, she thought. That was the thing Farber had said from the observer seat, and that the Commission had spent 18 months trying to build into a shared framework, and that the Quelari were still learning to see. You needed both. The numbers and what the numbers didn't capture. The records and the things that resisted recording. The catalog and the substrate. Maybe that was the thing the Commission was actually building. Not a new framework to replace the old one. A bigger one. One with fields for both. She heard, through the Commission, that the Quelari had begun a similar project in their administrative systems. The subcommittee report came through the main Commission channel in the usual dense format, and Marin read it on her phone on the train home, parsing the translation of a translation language that Commission documents always had. The relevant section was headed, in the English rendering, Administrative Language Development, Category Expansion for Connective Social Variable. The Quelari administrative systems had, as of the report's date, added 3 new fields to the standard planetary catalog. The first was rendered in English as relational density, a measure not of population, but of the connections between population, the intensity of the network of mutual meaning that a community maintained. It was, the report noted, currently being measured by proxy indicators because a direct measure had not yet been developed, and the proxy indicators were acknowledged as imperfect. The second was location-specific accumulated significance. What happened over time to a place where people had lived and worked and lost and celebrated, and repeated the small daily rituals that built, through repetition, the particular weight that made a street corner not just a street corner. The third had no English rendering that satisfied the translators. The Commission's linguistic subgroup had been working on it for 4 months and had produced 11 candidates, all of which were described in the report as partially adequate. The note from the Quellari analyst on the translation problem read, "The concept references a quality of connection between individuals that produces behavioral commitments not predictable from individual self-interest models." The nearest human term appears to be love, though human usage of this term varies significantly across contexts, and the Quellari category is more specific in some dimensions and broader in others. Working translation: the commitment that exceeds calculation. Marin read that phrase twice on the train. The commitment that exceeds calculation. She thought about the Budapest corridor. She thought about 2,000 people who knew each other's names, holding 11 days of a street-by-street line. She thought about the neighbor at 2 in the morning when the pipes burst, which was a thing Farber had said in that room, and which had become, in the Commission's shorthand, a recurring reference point. The 2 in the morning standard, one of the diplomatic aides had called it, meaning the set of commitments that a person would maintain not because they were contractually required to or because it was strategically advantageous, but because the connection existed and the connection had weight, and the weight was the whole point. She thought about the Quellari analyst sitting across a commission table, asking with genuine interest what the mechanism was, the operational process. The way a child might ask how a clock works, not to improve the clock, but because the workings were remarkable. She thought about Velerith at the Vienna Philharmonic, sitting alone in the emptying hall. The commitment that exceeds calculation. Yes, she thought, that's closer, that's almost it. The train pulled into Sector 7 North. She got off. The street outside the station was the same street it had always been, the same vendors, the same particular pattern of foot traffic in the evening, the same light falling at the same angle on the same buildings. It was not a scenic street. It was not historically significant. Nobody had written about it. The catalog would have it as a residential access route in a mid-density urban zone, useful for transit, assessed at standard maintenance priority. She walked home through it. She knew the vendor on the corner had bought things from him for 6 years, knew he kept late hours because he'd told her once that the evening was when the good customers came, people who weren't rushing. She knew the sound the door to her building made when it closed behind her. She knew the particular quality of the air in the stairwell at this hour. The combination of cooking smells from the floors above that told her who was home. A number, Sector 7 North, contracting pool clearance level. Home. She went upstairs. She made something to eat. She sat at her window and watched the street for a while, not monitoring it, not assessing it, just watching the way she'd learned to watch, interested in what was there, not trying to stop it. The commission session was in 4 days. She'd be there. The translator would be green.